Paul Brannen, and I'm going to be chairing this session. I work as the Director of Public Affairs.
Paul?
Oh. Have we lost Paul?
Yeah.
Shall we introduce ourselves?
While we're waiting for Paul, please do.
Okay.
Shall I kick off? My name is David Gardner. I'm the CIO of Gresham House Forestry. And Gresham House is a specialist alternative asset manager based in the UK and quoted on the London Stock Exchange. Just to put it in sort of perspective, we have about £5.4 billion worth of assets under management, of which just under £2 billion is forestry. So forestry is a big component of our business. We manage assets around the world, and as far as Western Europe goes, we are quite large. And we are clearly sort of #1 asset manager in the UK and provide somewhere around about 20% of the UK's timber into the UK market. So we are quite, we're very involved on a day-to-day basis with just providing timber into the merchants. We also do obviously a lot of acquisitions on behalf of both private clients and institutional investors. I joined them about 1.5 years ago from a background of international forestry and from a large American-based TIMO. On to Darius.
Yeah, okay, thanks, David. Hello, everybody. So my name is Darius Sarshar. I work for S11 Partners. We're a London-based specialist investment manager focusing on regenerative agriculture and ecological forestry strategies. We've got investment programs in Australia, beef cattle, in the US, organic row crops, and we have an Irish forestry fund which I've been running for a number of years since we launched it, and we're now raising a new vehicle for investment across a number of countries in Europe, both permanent crops and forestry.
Hi, my name is Peter Rose. I'm part of a family office. We've been investing in forests for about 20 years. Honestly, it probably started off as driven by tax reasons and just trying to make them profitable. But probably 10 years ago, on the basis of the wise words of David Attenborough, who quoted that they were an extraordinary renewable resource, we decided to look at the environmental angle. And from really being people who owned and ran forests, we decided, well, actually, we were quite good at originating, as in getting into deals, but understood the complexities of actually running a sustainable forest.
I wonder if I don't lead off with a sort of introduction to, here's Paul.
Terribly sorry, I have no idea what happened there. I've been talking to myself for a little while and then discovered that none of you were there. So I'm hoping that you've all introduced yourselves.
Yes.
And David, would you like to do some broad sort of oversight observations on our subject of investing in Western European forestry, please?
Perfect, thanks, Paul. So what I was like to lead off with perhaps it is Western Europe, but it is perhaps even global, is just to look very broadly at the sort of supply demand picture in forestry, because that leads to a whole lot of issues and questions which you'll probably have and which we'll cover later on in more detail. And certainly from a Gresham House point of view, we look at the last 20 years and we see growth in timber production at about sort of, or timber consumption, should I say, at about 1.1% annual growth per year. And if we look over the next 30 years, we see that massively increasing to around 3.1% annual growth. So a very substantial increase in timber demand. And the question might be, what is driving that? And we see three broad sort of mega drivers as such. One, of course, is urbanization. And we can see that, from a global point of view, global populations forecast to grow by another sort of 53% over the next 30 years. So it's population growth, but it's much more than that. It's where that population is moving from the rural economies into the cities. And that is driving an increase in the amount of housing required. And it's interesting, as we go through more developed companies and countries, so we come back to Western Europe, and you see all that urbanization has basically happened. And now we're in what we call suburbanization. So people are moving out of the cities and going out into the suburbs or into the countryside again. And from a timber point of view, that's really interesting, because multi-housing, so apartment blocks in the city centers, actually use a lot less timber than single dwelling units, which are really what's involved in suburbanization. So it's a move which increases the timber demand. Then we look at housing shortages. So most countries around the world have not been building enough houses over the last decade or so. And the UK and many European countries are in that situation where there is an overhang of required housing to be built. That will have to be caught up. It can't be put off forever. And so there will be changes to planning regulations. There'll be changes to sort of green belt. They'll have to free up more land for more houses. So that's another sort of underpinning for the demand. And then we have the main topic of sort of decarbonization. And of course, Europe is a leading edge in the decarbonization of the economies. And this involves a lot of things. But when it comes to forestry, it means that it's all related to how much wood goes into construction and the carbon efficiencies in doing that. And so we can see that timber is a very natural and sustainable product. It's extremely carbon efficient, and it often will replace very carbon intensive materials. So those are the three sort of mega drivers, and the supply side is fairly constrained. There just hasn't been enough planting in Western Europe or anywhere in the world to really counter these increases in demand. And therefore we see, a tightening of that supply demand situation. And the logical conclusion is that there will be some increases in pricing going forward, which is good for forestry investors looking forward. And maybe I'll leave it there at that very high level and an introduction to sort of the broader things going ahead.
Thank you very much, David. And Darius, would you like to give us your overview, please?
Yeah, I would pick up from what David said, and we've got the background of growing demand, and David just got on to really a couple of the main drivers of that. But stepping back a little bit, Europe is a global forest industry powerhouse. It's got a massive forest resource and very substantial forest products industry, and its forest resource is 60% privately owned on average. But the bulk of those privately owned forests belong to small non-industrial owners and very fragmented small properties, and a lot of those are undermanaged, either because they're sort of uneconomic or because the aging owners are just not interested in that resource. And so what we've got is right across Europe is a sort of problem of a lack of management or neglect. In some places, Iberian Peninsula, that can mean forests become a fire hazard. In others, it can mean that rather than growing rapidly and sequestering carbon and contributing to climate change mitigation, they're actually the growth is starting to slow, they're senescing, dying, and they're going to be net emitters or not contributing nearly as much as they could do if they were actively managed. So it becomes a real problem for some countries in terms of their sort of forest sector actually stopping and not actively contributing to climate change mitigation in the way that they could do. So active management is very important. And the long-term future of these forests and who owns them is in question. At the same time, we see institutional ownership in Europe being very, very low, like 1%, whereas in the US, it's like 69% of privately owned forests. Institutions have predominantly invested in developed forest investment markets like the US, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK to some extent, but not really in Western Europe because the asset base is so fragmented. And it's an investment, key part of investment strategy of companies like SLM to aggregate these small properties. It's heavy going, it's hard work aggregating small properties, but eventually we'll achieve institutional scale portfolios, and we'll see over the next few decades large inflows of institutional capital into the forest sector in Europe, leaving the more developed markets, which are overbought, assets are very highly priced, and moving into Europe when these larger portfolios are booked to build up and to buy and acquire and long-term hold these larger portfolios and bring that active management, which is so important.
Thank you, Darius. Now, Peter, have you heard anything particularly from David and Darius that you'd like to comment on? Better still, still disagree with.
No. Well, it's not disagree, it's mainly question, I would say. So no, it's really interesting what David spoke about, the growth rate. But actually, forest as an investment, and I can say this has been a great investment for us. So I don't know the different drivers of investments, but certainly, I mean, our portfolio roughly it returned about 15% with extremely low standard deviation and low correlation to any other assets. So it didn't quite map the actual growth of the timber industry. It was way ahead of the 1.3 as an investment. And I'd love to know your views on that and whether you think the drivers going forward are going to change.
I'll just add something from a European perspective. At a European level, the key driver for the Commission and the Parliament is to get to net zero by 2050. And within that, one of the big chunks, if you break down that great big problem, is to decarbonize the built environment, which is Europe's no different from the global situation. Around about 38–40% of carbon emissions are linked to the built environment. So how we heat and cool our homes, buildings, and how we build them. And one of the things that the European Union has agreed to do is a renovation wave. So between now and 2050, 190 million buildings, which is about 75% of the built environment at a European level, needs to be renovated. And in most cases, that involves being insulated better than it currently is. So there's a great big opportunity there. And the materials that we use in that renovation wave are one of the things that's been much debated at the moment. It was mentioned earlier that by David that there is an opportunity through the use of wood to replace more carbon intensive materials. And there's a danger, particularly with insulation, because at the moment, the vast majority of insulation at a European level, maybe as high as 99%, is fossil fuel based. And there's a very, very small component of nature-based materials, which would include wood. So the danger is that we renovate and insulate our buildings across Europe. So that would be two big steps forward in the battle against climate change. But we use, if you like, the wrong materials, which would then be 1.5 steps backwards, because we would release a whole load of carbon in using those materials. And which is something we've been trying to convey to the politicians, is you would miss the opportunity to store a great deal of carbon in the built environment. And here I would refer you to the work of someone who has been referred to in Germany as the climate pope, Professor Schnellenhuber of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And he's the academic thinker behind Ursula von der Leyen, head of the Commission's drive for a new European Bauhaus, which has sustainability at its core and includes the built environment. And he's been pointing out we could store a huge amount of carbon in the built environment. So in the context of today's whole event, we've been very focused on forests and the fact they can store carbon, and therefore potentially we can trade that stored carbon. There's a big, big opening market coming, which is the carbon which is going to be stored in the built environment going forwards. and that too potentially could be traded in future. And I'll put in the chat a document which was recently released by the Commission, which came out of the 2 years ago, a major piece of legislation passed on land use change and forestry, which contained within it a request to the Commission to look at how to incentivize the use of wood in construction. And this is the report, which gives an excellent overview of what's happening at a European level. France and Finland are two case studies where we're starting to see governments leading on this. And it was a bit weak and a bit disappointing on what do we actually now do to do this incentivizing, but it's coming. And I would flag that up to the audience is that, yes, you will be able to offset carbon emissions through forests. You will also probably in 5, 10, 15 years time to be able to offset your carbon emissions by buying the carbon that's in the built environment, which will hopefully there in increasing amounts. So that's just a kind of European observation. David, I saw you're nodding your head there, which is good. How do you see this panning out?
Well, I think I was just going to give a sort of example of what you were saying. So the city of Helsinki built 4 very similar 5-story apartment blocks, 2 of which were made out of wood and 2 which were made out of traditional concrete and steel. And the production of materials used in those wooden buildings was 74% lower carbon footprint. So it's dramatic. I mean, it's not just a little bit more carbon efficient. It is really dramatically carbon efficient. And on top of that, you get all the wood stored exactly making your point. And I think that is definitely, it'll either be directly a carbon credit for building in wood, which of course the forest owner doesn't see. But I think what will happen is that the forest owner will not get the benefits of the carbon credits from existing forests. But I think what will happen is he will get the benefit of the carbon because I think there'll be carbon taxed or carbon restrictions on construction, which means builders will want to use more wood, replacing steel and concrete. And therefore, timber price will rise, and therefore, indirectly, the forest owner will start to get the benefit of that carbon.
And how do you see it, Darius?
Well, I agree with what you said. I think the long-term demand trends are for growing GDP, and that's highly correlated with demand for timber products. There's this move towards decarbonising construction. I think energy is another important one. Sort of biomass energy supplies from forests. Well, biomass is really a sort of byproduct. A lot of it comes from the sawmilling industry as a sort of waste product of that. But there's also very low value wood coming out associated with harvesting for saw logs, which are going to construction timber and so on. And one of the byproducts is lower value wood. And if you can't sell it to a pulp mill, if you can't sell it to a panel mill, so it's ultimately going into construction, the sort of lowest valued market often is biomass energy. And so there, I mean, in Ireland, for example, it's substituting for peat, which is commonly grown fires, power stations and fires, family fireplaces. So it's going in to substitute for these sort of fossil energy sources. So I think it has a benefit there. And in terms of the growth and supply, obviously, everyone will know that forestry, there's a big lag time. You can't, even if you plant a forest today, it takes a long time for that to mature. There's limited land availability for new afforestation, and even when changing and improving productivity of existing forests, there are a number of challenges. We kind of more or less reached the economic frontier of forestry globally, and so we expect demand to significantly outstrip supply over the foreseeable future.
I'm glad you mentioned peat there. It often gets overlooked, partly because it's not something that's found everywhere in Europe. But the UK has despite being a geographically relatively small country, has a disproportionate amount of peat. And one of the many things I learned during my time as a member of the European Parliament is that there's more carbon stored in the peatlands of Northern England than in all of the forest of Germany, France, and the UK put together. So certainly in a UK context, I think there's a growing awareness that when it comes to storing carbon, as well as forests, there is the peatland, and we're seeing people putting money into restoring peatlands and looking after peatlands, and as a way of offsetting your carbon emissions. And I think this kind of combination of the forest itself, the peatlands where they exist, which at a European level tends to be referred to as wetlands rather than peatlands. So that terminology, so wetlands at a European level, forestry at a European level, but also the built environment increasingly at a European level, I think are the three, if you like, portfolios. And I can see a sort of annual report from a major blue chip company in 2 or 3 years' time, having 3 pictures, the forest where we've offset, the peatland where we've offset, and the timber building where we've offset. And I think that will become increasingly common. Or Peter, is that wishful thinking, or do you think there's a trend there?
No, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, when we're talking about, I believe, I look at the laminated timber industry, which is just growing, and it's amazing. 15% cheaper, 30% probably faster to erect, yet only, I think, 27% of new houses are built in the UK. That's UK focused on timber. But I guess what we're talking about here is lots of demand. There's demand on construction, there's demand maybe on biomass, and there's an argument about biofuels. But I guess what I'd like to ask you two guys is, in order to do this, we've got to sustainably forest, because we can't have this excessive demand, which then takes away our supply, which will kill our sinks. So in your guys' views, what is the best approach to sustainable forestry?
Excellent question. Darius, do you want to go first on how do we make sure that we do what we do sustainably?
Yeah, I think the forest management is very important, because I mean, I'll maybe do with some mitigation and adaptation separately. I mean, you talked about, Paul, you talked about peatland, but if we focus on soils more generally, the forest soils often have far more carbon in than the standing trees, would you believe it? And that if you look across the forestry forest carbon accounting plans for European countries, as I've been doing over the last few months, it's striking the percentage of carbon that's stored in the soils. And if you get a clear fell operation where you're every 30, 40, 50, 60 years, you're clearing the forest completely, exposing the soil, you get a big pulse of oxidation of soil organic carbon. So we need to think about how we manage forests optimally as carbon stores, and we've adopted a continuous cover approach, which avoids clear felling and relies very much on a permanent forest cover with periodic, regular, strong thinning, and relying on natural regeneration. And that leads to the second aspect of that, which is the climate change adaptation. So whilst decarbonising our energy systems and our built environment might be good for forestry in terms of integrating demand, climate change does create some challenges, and that could be increased drought, fire, storms, pest and disease attack, because the trees are stressed. We've seen that in Western Europe, large-scale droughts causing beetle infestation and lots of wood flooding the market over the last sort of decade. And so we think that a management approach that relies on a wider diversity of species, natural regeneration to encourage more diversity, and involves thinning wherever possible, so that you're exposing those trees to wind earlier on in their life, they become more robust. So, for example, climate change in Ireland and sort of Western British Isles, a lot of where Gresham, David has a lot of his forest, it's likely to get wetter and more storms. And so creating forests and building storm resilience into forests is going to be very important. And we think on some sites, that not wet sites that are hanging off the edge of a mountain, but on most sites, lower sites, less exposed sites, if you do thin early on, and encourage natural regeneration, you get much more robust forests, you get a wide diversity of species. So if you get an attack of pest and disease, you've got other options. And if your trees blow down or undying, you've got in natural regeneration, you might have trees that are already 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years old in the understory. So you're not starting from scratch, right? All these trees have got to be cleared, they're all died. We have to start again from the beginning. It's much more economically efficient to start again with this cohort of younger trees on the undergrowth. So we think continuous cover has a lot of advantages in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation.
And David, do you want to pick on this sustainability issue? And could you say something about the annual increment, which is sometimes talked about at a European level?
Sure. So let me just follow on with Darius. So, if you look at continuous cover, that goes back to the very early German forestry in the year dot. So they always did continuous cover. And as forestry developed in Europe and perhaps through into conifers and more commercial forestry, it went too much the other way. If you look at the sort of 80s plantings, where there was enormous amount of planting, often on peat, so and in huge monocultures, that's an impression that some people have about forestry in Europe, these sort of huge monocultures. And if you look at today's plantings, well, no forester wants to do that anymore, and legislation won't let them do it even if he did want to do it. And so forestry has changed dramatically. Now, on a commercial forest, there still is a portion of it, often under monoculture, because that's often on these upland sites, actually the way that you will get a forest that will be healthy. If you plant a lot of species that aren't suited to those conditions, you're going to have a sick forest, and it's not going to be productive, and it won't be economical. But in addition to the commercial timber, there is always much more open areas and a wide range of biodiverse hardwoods and things growing as amenity planting, for wildlife breaks, for animal corridors, a whole lot of good reasons why you don't have the forestry we used to have. And I think, again, on the lowland sites, you have much more flexibility to thinning, to doing continuous cover forestry. And as you move up the hill, where traditionally forestry has been for many parts of Europe, you find that actually your management regimes are more limited. You're on poorer soils, you're on more exposed sites, and therefore wind and other issues means that your management choices are restricted. So I think it's all good. I think forestry has gone completely that way. The size of the felling coops has got very small. We're heading towards continuous cover and suiting different conditions. As far as MAIs go, yes, MAI means mean annual increment. And that means it's the way foresters measure growth rates. And so over the age of the crop, you will end up with a certain amount of volume of timber. You divide it by the years that it took to get there, and you get your mean, and then you get an average, which is your mean annual increment. And somewhere like Ireland and the west coast of Scotland are fantastically productive areas because they're warm and moist in European terms. So very high growth rates. And as you come up into the Nordics, you get very slow growth rates, which produce, in many ways, high quality timber with very close growth rings. But the timber that is grown, so you get a wide range, but their rotations are maybe 80 to 100 years. So you get very wide range of growth rates and types of timber grown in Europe, and they all have a place.
I've posted in the chat a map of the forest that was planted in Doddington in the northeast of England, up near the Scottish border. It was planted 3 years ago, and this was the first major piece of commercial forestry planted in the UK at that point for 10 years. Nothing similar has been planted since. It's actually surprisingly difficult to plant a new large commercial forest in the UK, despite the fact that everyone thinks that planting more trees is a good idea. And you can see from that it is a very much mixed. There's open space, there's some native planting in there, and there's not just one type of conifer. On the flip side, the Sitka spruce often gets sort of much maligned. But we need to recognize that we're in the midst of a climate crisis, and certainly in many settings, conifers are the trees which grow the fastest and therefore absorb carbon the fastest of all trees. And while the oak is great for biodiversity, it grows very, very slowly and therefore absorbs carbon very, very slowly. So there's getting a balance. No one's suggesting we plant 100% commercial. No one's suggesting we should be suggesting we plant 100% native. It's getting some kind of balance in there. Can we sort of move on now? And you know, obviously many people who are involved and listening are on that financial side. So at a kind of UK stroke European level, where do you see the financial returns for investments into forestry and associated activities being at their best at a European level? Where should people be looking? Who'd like to go first on that?
I'll have a quick stab at it, if I may, and that just sort of brings me back to what sort of Peter's comment about having, you know, as a UK investor, he's made fantastic returns. Well, that's true. You know, over the last few years, some of the UK forest holdings have risen by, you know, 15 to 20% in value. It's unbelievable returns. And I think this is because in the early days of the UK forests, they were very, very undervalued. And so now they've sort of rejoined global sort of timber pricing. And that's because UK imports around 80% of its wood. And so timber in this country is dictated by the timber parity of imported timber. So as timber prices rise around the world, the UK has obviously tracked that now. And so you're getting forest owners who bought forests 10, 15, 20 years ago are really very happy people. And that is obviously, there's been serious yield compression as more and more people understand forestry, understand it's a great investment. And so, you know, we're seeing now that you're probably looking more towards a sort of 6% return rather than double digits, which you would earlier have looked at. It's still a very good risk-adjusted return because it is generally a low-risk investment. It's a long-term investment. It's suited to family offices. It's suited to pension funds. In the UK, it's a little bit skewed because of the tax advantages, and particularly inheritance tax. And that generally has made it a base for individuals. And what we see now is a massive interest from institutions now. And I think UK is not alone. This has changed in a lot of Western Europe. This, as Darius pointed out, this change from private ownership to institutional. And it's because the returns are there and they're well suited for long-term patient capital.
Darius, where would you point people to in Europe?
I differ a little bit with David on this, in that I think I totally agree that over the last few decades, UK forestry has been a fantastic investment. The same with the US, with the whole forest investment as a sector sort of started in the US. I think Australia and New Zealand have also in the past offered good returns to investors, but much less so now. I think with that yield compression that David said, a lot of assets really got bought up. And so a lot of institutions are actually looking to say, well, hold on, rather than our funds, we have these closed-end funds coming to an end, and then we're selling the assets, and then having to look for more in order to stay invested in the asset class. Why don't we turn these funds into sort of evergreen funds, or why don't we extend the duration of these funds and have the right to buy out those investors that want to leave? But essentially, the bulk of us probably want to be in this for the long term because they're well matched to our liabilities. They generate a nice income yield, and they're stable asset values and low risk and so on. So I think that what's happened is that the institutional capital is sort of either locked in to these overbought markets, and really there's nothing else they can buy at a good price. So they're sort of either stuck in those vehicles, or they're getting out and they're finding the assets are sort of overpriced. So I think that institutional capital is looking, and we're getting more and more institutional capital looking to invest in forestry and agriculture to some extent, and trying to find a suitable home. And there aren't many well-priced assets out there. I worked for a long time in Asia, and it's sort of meager pickings really There weren't really many mature assets, and you had to sort of do a lot of afforestation in order to create the assets in the future. In Europe, it's a bit different. In Western Europe, it's a bit different. There's this massive resource base. It's privately owned, and a lot of the owners are aging and want to sell up, and there are no buyers. So assets are extremely well priced, but these assets are highly fragmented. So it's a lot of work to aggregate. I mean, it really is brutal in some cases, and it means sort of smaller funds, because there's only a certain limit to how much you can buy in a single year if your asset base is highly fragmented. But I think that the future in terms of will be in buying these undermanaged forests across Western Europe. Now, I've looked right across Europe. In some countries, forestry assets are ridiculously priced. There's a sentimental, non-commercial value attributed, but in many other countries, that's not the case. And so we're actively looking to pursue an aggregation strategy and buy where assets are well priced, but it will be it is a challenging investment strategy to do. It's slow to accumulate to achieve scale. It's something we've been doing in Ireland over the last sort of 5 years, and we're finally achieving the sorts of scales, the sort of thousands of hectares, which, you know, the sort of assets that David might buy 2 or 3 assets maximum, but in Ireland that's 60 properties we've had to buy to accumulate that. So it's a different type of strategy, not without its challenges, but I think that's where the money will go.
We have about 4,000 hectares under management in Ireland. We know how that is, and so likewise we're well placed to do the aggregation strategies that are needed.
And although we're focusing on Western Europe, I mean, my understanding of Eastern Europe is that while there's a lot of potential there, underused agricultural land, there is this issue of fragmentation. And the European Commission are looking at land consolidation and helping countries to consolidate land, which was something that happened in Greece when Greece joined the European Union. So I think some interesting developments there to look out for. There's a question in the chat. What's the current level of awareness or interest for carbon sequestration amongst industrial timber producers, typically pulp and paper sector? Anyone like that? I mean, I can have a go at that. Anyone else want to?
Why don't you start and we'll fill in?
Right. So I think across the supply chain, as you come out of the forest, there is an awareness of everyone who uses a forest product that there is the potential to store carbon. And we've got this kind of split, if you like, between the long life harvested wood products, which would be timber in construction or renovation, and then the short life products, which is where the paper and the card comes in. And I think we need to be careful here about judging one is better than the other, even though I'm from the wood sector. It was very interesting, certainly in the UK, is when COVID hit and there was a bit of panic buying in the shops. You know, what disappeared first? You know, it was the toilet paper. It's clearly customers valuing a product which has a short life. But even those short life products have the big advantage is that they're replacing potentially more carbon intensive materials. So your cardboard cup might not last very long, but it is replacing a plastic cup. And potentially from a wider climate change perspective, that's an advantage. I think there's an issue here about recycling, and certainly paper recycling in many places is up now very high. So we need to keep working at that recycling and reusing materials where we can. I think the top line answer to that question is there is an awareness, and I think we'll see a greater value put on the long life products that store carbon. At the moment, we estimate maybe about 15% of timber at a European level ends up in the built environment and therefore has a very, very potentially very long life of 50, 100, 300 years. And we want to grow that percentage, 15, 20, 25. That's probably what it is in new build. But as I said earlier, in insulation for that renovation market, it's basically non-existent. So there's a massive potential market there for very fast growth for wood fiber based insulation. David, pick up, please.
So, you know, obviously across the industry, there is this interest. And I'm just thinking, I visited a sawmill recently where they do a lot of timber production for pallets, but they also actually are one of the largest pallet repair firms in the world. So what those pallets are, instead of just being, what would have happened past, maybe they got damaged, they would just be thrown out and gone into landfill. Now they're circulating. It's in a circular economy. They're coming back. They're being replaced. They're being repaired, out again in a very, very organized way. And what that's doing is replacing plastic pallets. Where before these companies that just couldn't get enough wooden pallets were starting to go to plastic because plastic could be reused. They were stronger. But the fact is that the timber pallets, as long as they're in a very in a cycle where they're repaired and out again quickly, means that this is a reusable product that's going for and being reused many, many, many times over the very long lifespan. It's really interesting.
Yeah. We're into our last 5 minutes. So Peter, I was going to bring you in now to comment on this or anything more generally, and then
I was just going to comment on that. I mean, I think if you think about, we can look at forests in isolation to the world, but in fact, we're part of an economy. So take packaging, for instance, and the amount of shopping that's now done online. And I don't think we've really yet done the real kind of analysis to show just how much maybe online shopping saves as far as CO2 emissions. My gut is it does, which means that packaging that's used, which you could argue takes away from sequestration, actually has benefit in a CO2 perspective. But I think we need to do more work on it.
So I'm going to come to a question for all three of you, probably which will finish us off because we're now with only 3 minutes left. But from the point of view of the emerging role of forest carbon, what excites you? What do you think is just around the corner as regards forest carbon?
Well, I think we were, just a brief thing from me, I've been interested to see what comes out of Article 6 of the UN Framework of Climate Change. So not quite sure where that's got to, but the possibility of a regulatory market or a more robust and growing voluntary market for forest carbon credits, I think would be an interesting development, and we've seen it. The bulk of the voluntary market is forestry, and the voluntary market's hit $1 billion in value this year, or just going to exceed that. So it's an exciting, growing sort of segment that potentially would generate additional values and mean that we have to get better at accounting for carbon emissions in the forest, and also the half-life of carbon in the products that it goes into. So it will encourage, I think, management for higher value, longer lived wood products, so higher value crops. So that's something that probably...
Right. 1 minute, Peter and David, on what excites you. Peter first.
Well, I think construction and energy. I think, we mentioned building construction, cross laminated timber. This is fascinating stuff. Replacing steel, concrete, aluminium with timber, storing carbon for thousands of years. I think this has to be a major part of our road to net zero. Yeah.
The ability to build at height and in scale with wood.
Is that Japan
in the world?
No,
That's in Norway, and that's 18 stories from cross-laminated timber. Yeah. Exactly. David, what excites you?
I think a lot of what's been said is really sums it up. But I think for me, every year there's a greater awareness that forestry is really a truly sustainable investment. And I think every year that becomes, and as we get into this climate crisis, that becomes more and more important. Investors are recognizing it as a really truly sustainable investment that provides decent returns. It's a great story, and it always will be.
I think the emphasis is we've got to keep bearing in mind it all needs to be done sustainably, but wood is a product which grows pretty much everywhere in the world, and this opportunity to build and renovate in wood when you run it alongside growing the wood in the forest, which sequesters the carbon in the first place, and then we can take the timber out of the forest and use it to build with, and that continues to store carbon. And of course, we replant, and those new trees get going again, and they start to absorb more carbon. And this is what Professor Schnellenhuber has been talking about in his reference to what he calls the forest pump, is that we can store carbon. I mean, the politicians are desperate to have carbon capture and storage as a technical invention, and we may well get there, which would be great, but we already have it because trees can do it. It's one of those, let's make sure we can see the wood for the trees and make best use of this ability to store carbon first in the forests and then in the built environment. And I think the carbon credits will go with both of those in due course. So thank you all very much, and thank you for listening to this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.